Picture a young girl, trembling under a spotlight, the daughter of a dishwasher, mocked by a powerful manager who dares her to share her story. Everyone expects her to falter. But what if her words carry a truth so raw it shatters hearts and unveils a hidden injustice? This isn't just a story of courage. It's a melody of pain, hope, and redemption that'll echo in your soul. Join us on Endless Stories for a tale that'll make you feel every heartbeat. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and let's dive in. If you've ever felt the sting of being overlooked, if you believe truth can heal, join the Endless Stories family. Subscribe now, share this video, and comment "Truth Prevails" to show you're with us. Let's uncover this journey of heart and justice together. The Grand Dining Hall of the Silver Oak, a Michelin-starred restaurant in the heart of San Francisco, buzzed with anticipation on the evening of May 25, 2025. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the polished mahogany tables, where the city's elite sipped vintage wine and nibbled on amuse-bouches prepared by a world-renowned chef. Tonight was the restaurant's annual gala, a glittering event where staff and patrons mingled to celebrate another year of culinary excellence. But beneath the clink of glasses and the murmur of small talk, an undercurrent of tension simmered, one that would soon erupt into a moment no one would forget. Lila Monroe stood in the corner near the kitchen doors, her small frame nearly swallowed by the shadows of the opulent room. At 15, she was a wisp of a girl, her dark hair pulled back in a messy braid, her thrift store dress a faded shade of blue that clashed with the elegance around her. Her hands clutched a small notebook, its pages worn and dog-eared, a gift from her mother years ago. Lila's mother, Maria Monroe, worked as a dishwasher at the Silver Oak, her hands perpetually raw from scrubbing pots in the steamy kitchen. Tonight, Maria had begged Lila to come, hoping her daughter might see a glimpse of a world beyond their cramped apartment in the Tenderloin district. "Just for a few hours, Mija," Maria had said, her voice soft but weary. "You deserve to see something beautiful." Lila had agreed, but beauty felt far away now. She hovered near the kitchen, her brown eyes darting nervously around the room, her heart pounding as she watched the staff, waiters in crisp uniforms, chefs in white coats, bustle past her without a second glance. She was invisible here, just the dishwasher's daughter, a nobody in a sea of somebodies. That invisibility felt safe, until a voice cut through the noise like a knife, sharp and mocking. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention?" The voice belonged to Victor Langston, the restaurant's general manager, a man whose polished exterior hid a reputation for cruelty among the staff. At 45, Victor was a towering figure in a tailored tuxedo, his blonde hair slicked back, his smile as cold as the ice sculptures adorning the tables. He stood on a small stage at the front of the hall, a microphone in hand, his green eyes scanning the crowd with the confidence of a man who knew he owned the room. The chatter died down, all eyes turning to him as he raised a glass of champagne. "Tonight, we celebrate the Silver Oak's legacy," he began, his voice smooth but edged with arrogance. "But before we toast, I'd like to do something special." Victor's gaze landed on Lila, pinning her like a spotlight. She froze, her breath catching as he pointed at her, his smile widening into something predatory. "We have a little guest tonight," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Lila Monroe, the daughter of our dishwasher, Maria. Why don't you come up here, Lila? I hear you like to write stories." Laughter rippled through the crowd, a cruel, tinkling sound that made Lila's cheeks burn. She glanced at her mother, who stood near the kitchen doors, her face pale with fear, her hands twisting a dish towel. Maria shook her head slightly, a silent plea to stay put, but Victor's voice boomed again. "Come on, don't be shy. If you can share a story that moves us, I might just give you a little prize." More laughter, louder now, as if the room had turned into a theater of ridicule. Lila's heart raced, her legs trembling beneath her, but something inside her shifted. A spark of defiance, a whisper of her mother's strength. She thought of the notebook in her hands, the stories she'd written in the flickering light of their apartment, stories of her mother's struggles, her dreams, her pain, stories no one in this room had ever cared to hear. Victor expected her to crumble, to run, to prove she was nothing more than a poor girl with nothing to say. But Lila wasn't nothing. She took a shaky step forward, then another, her sneakers silent on the polished floor, her eyes fixed on the stage. The laughter died down, replaced by murmurs of surprise as she climbed the steps, her small frame dwarfed by the towering manager. Victor smirked, stepping aside to let her take the microphone. His voice a low taunt as he leaned in. "Go on, kid. Tell us your little story. Make us laugh." The crowd tittered again, but Lila didn't flinch. She opened her notebook, her fingers trembling as they found the page she'd marked with a faded ribbon. A page she'd never shared with anyone but her mother. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "My name is Lila Monroe," she began, her eyes lifting to meet the crowd's. "And this is the story of my mother, a woman you've never seen, but who's carried this place on her back for years." The air shifted, the weight of her words settling over the room like a storm cloud. Lila's voice grew steadier, her story unfolding like a melody of pain and resilience. A tale of a mother who worked through exhaustion, who faced cruelty and unfairness, who dreamed of a better life for her daughter but was silenced by those who saw her as nothing. The crowd listened, their faces shifting from amusement to discomfort, then to something deeper, something that looked like shame. Victor's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing, but Lila didn't stop. She was just beginning, and the truth she carried would soon bring the room to its knees. The grand dining hall of the Silver Oak fell into a hushed stillness, the kind that felt like the moment before a storm breaks, as Lila Monroe's voice echoed through the microphone. The crystal chandeliers above seemed to dim under the weight of her words, the golden light casting long shadows across the faces of San Francisco's elite on this May evening in 2025. Lila stood on the small stage, her faded blue dress a stark contrast to the opulence around her, her small hands clutching the worn notebook as if it were a shield. At 15, she was a whisper in a room of shouts, but her voice, soft, trembling at first, but growing steadier with each word, carried a power that no one had expected. The crowd, moments ago laughing at the manager's cruel dare, now sat frozen, their eyes locked on the dishwasher's daughter they dismissed as nothing. Victor Langston stood to the side, his tailored tuxedo pristine, but his smirk had faded into a thin line of unease. The general manager of the Silver Oak had thought this would be a moment of amusement, a chance to flex his power over the staff and their families, to remind everyone who held the reins in this glittering empire of fine dining. He'd dared Lila to share her story, expecting her to stumble, to prove she was just a poor girl with nothing worth hearing. But as Lila spoke, her words weaving a tapestry of pain and resilience, Victor felt the air shift, a chill creeping up his spine. He glanced at the crowd, searching for a flicker of the amusement they'd shared moments ago, but found only wide eyes and parted lips, the kind of silence that comes when truth cuts too deep. "My mother came to this country with nothing but a dream," Lila said, her voice soft but piercing, each word a note in a melody of sorrow and strength. "She worked her hands raw in that kitchen, scrubbing pots until her fingers bled, all so I could have a chance at something better. But you didn't see her. None of you did." She paused, her brown eyes scanning the room, lingering on the faces of the patrons. Tech moguls, socialites, food critics, who now sat rigid in their velvet chairs. "You didn't see the nights she came home crying, her back aching, her spirit breaking, because people like you made her feel like she was nothing." Maria Monroe stood near the kitchen doors, her dish towel twisted so tightly in her hands that her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded as she listened to her daughter, a mix of pride and fear swelling in her chest. She'd begged Lila not to come up on that stage, knowing the kind of cruelty Victor was capable of, the kind of cruelty she'd endured for years as a dishwasher at the Silver Oak. Maria had seen Victor dock her pay for being 2 minutes late, heard him berate staff until they quit, watched him smile at patrons while whispering threats to those who kept the restaurant running. But she'd stayed silent, swallowing her pride for Lila's sake, for the dream of a better life. Now, as Lila spoke, Maria felt that silence crack, a flood of memories threatening to spill over. Lila's voice rose, a quiet fire igniting in her words as she turned the page in her notebook, her fingers brushing the faded ribbon that marked her story. "She used to tell me about her dreams," Lila continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She wanted to be a teacher, to help kids like me learn, to give them hope. But she gave that up to work here to survive. And do you know what she got in return? Not respect, not kindness. She got screamed at, humiliated, told she was lucky to even have this job." Lila's gaze shifted to Victor, her voice trembling but unyielding. "She got a manager who made her work through a fever, who docked her pay when she missed a shift to take me to the doctor, who laughed when she begged for a day off after working doubles for a month straight." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of shock and discomfort. A woman in a sequined gown lowered her champagne glass, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. A man in a tailored suit shifted in his seat, his brow furrowing as he glanced at Victor, whose face had turned a shade paler, his hands clenching at his sides. The manager opened his mouth to interrupt, to regain control, but Lila's voice cut through the air like a blade, stopping him cold. "And then," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the room, "there was the night she came home with bruises on her arms. She wouldn't tell me how she got them, but I heard her crying in the bathroom, whispering that she couldn't take it anymore." The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the air from the hall. Maria's hands flew to her mouth, a sob escaping her lips as she turned away, her shoulders shaking. The memory of that night flooded back. The night Victor had cornered her in the kitchen after hours, his voice a venomous hiss as he berated her for a broken plate, his grip on her arm leaving marks that lingered for weeks. She'd told no one, not even Lila, but her daughter had heard the tears, seen the shadows in her eyes, and pieced together the truth in the pages of her notebook. Lila's voice broke, a single tear slipping down her cheek, but she didn't stop. "My mother is the strongest person I know," she said, her words a quiet storm. "She's the heart of this place, the one who keeps it running while you sip your wine and laugh at her. But you broke her, and you thought you could break me too." She looked at Victor, her eyes burning with a defiance that belied her small frame, and the manager took a step back, his confidence crumbling under the weight of her gaze. The crowd was silent now, the earlier laughter replaced by a heavy, aching stillness. A waiter in the back wiped his eyes, his hands trembling as he thought of his own struggles under Victor's reign. A chef whispered to another, I knew something was wrong," his voice thick with guilt. Lila closed her notebook, her hands steady now, the trembling replaced by a quiet resolve. She hadn't finished her story, not yet, but she'd already struck a chord, a note of truth that reverberated through the room, cracking the facade of the silver oak wide open. Victor's face twisted with anger, but beneath it was something else, fear. The kind that comes when a man realizes he's lost control of the narrative he thought he owned. Lila stepped back from the microphone, her small frame a silhouette against the glittering backdrop, and the room held its breath, waiting for what came next. They didn't know the full truth yet, didn't know the secret that would soon unravel everything, but they felt it coming. A storm of justice that would leave no one untouched. The dining hall of the Silver Oak was a cathedral of silence, the kind that presses down like a heavy fog, as Lila Monroe stepped back from the microphone on that May evening in 2025. The San Francisco elite sat frozen in their velvet chairs, their champagne glasses untouched, their faces a gallery of shock and shame. The crystal chandeliers above cast a faint glow, but the warmth of the light couldn't touch the chill that Lila's words had left behind. Her story, a raw, unfiltered melody of her mother Maria's struggles, had stripped the room bare, exposing the underbelly of the glittering empire they'd all taken for granted. Lila, at 15, stood small but unyielding, her faded blue dress a quiet rebellion against the opulence around her. Her worn notebook now closed in her hands, its pages heavy with truths yet untold. Victor Langston's face was a mask of fury, his green eyes narrowing as he gripped the edge of the stage, his knuckles white. The general manager of the Silver Oak had orchestrated this moment as a cruel jest, daring the dishwasher's daughter to speak, expecting her to falter under the weight of their laughter. But Lila hadn't faltered. Her story had turned the crowd against him, their earlier amusement replaced by a dawning realization of the injustice that fueled this restaurant's success. Victor's voice cut through the silence, sharp and forced, a desperate attempt to regain control. "That's enough," he snapped, stepping forward, his tuxedo gleaming under the lights. "This isn't a therapy session. We're here to celebrate, not to listen to sob stories." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of unease and dissent. A woman in a sequined gown stood, her voice trembling but firm. "Let her finish," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "We need to hear this." A man in a suit, a prominent food critic, nodded in agreement, his brow furrowed. "She's right. We've been blind." Victor's jaw clenched, his gaze darting between Lila and the crowd, searching for an ally, but finding none. The tide had turned, and he felt it slipping through his fingers like sand. Lila's brown eyes met Victor's, unflinching, a quiet storm brewing behind them. She opened her notebook again, her voice steady now, a melody that carried the weight of years of unspoken pain. "You don't get to decide when I'm done," she said, her words a soft thunder. "My mother's story isn't finished, and neither is mine." The crowd leaned forward, hanging on her every word, as she turned the page, her fingers brushing the faded ribbon that marked her truth. "2 years ago," she began, "my mother came home with a broken wrist. She said she slipped in the kitchen, but I knew better. I saw the fear in her eyes, the way she flinched when I touched her arm. She wouldn't tell me who did it, but I heard her whisper his name in her sleep, Victor." A gasp tore through the room, louder this time, a collective shock that seemed to shake the very walls. Maria Monroe, still standing near the kitchen doors, let out a choked sob, her hands covering her face as the memory of that night flooded back. It had been late, after a grueling 14-hour shift, when Victor had cornered her in the kitchen, his voice a hiss as he blamed her for a spoiled batch of stock. "You're useless," he'd snarled, grabbing her wrist and twisting until she cried out, the bones snapping under his grip. He'd sent her home with a warning, "Speak, and you're done." Maria had kept silent, her fear for Lila's future outweighing her pain. But now, as Lila spoke, that silence shattered. Victor's face turned ashen, his hands shaking as he pointed at Lila, his voice rising to a shout. "That's a lie, you little—" But he stopped, the words dying in his throat as the crowd erupted in whispers, their eyes turning to him with a mix of disgust and suspicion. A waiter named Carlos, who'd worked at the Silver Oak for a decade, stepped forward, his voice trembling with anger. "I saw it," he said, his accent thick with emotion. "I was there that night, cleaning the bar. I saw what you did to Maria. I wanted to speak, but I was scared. We all were." Another staff member, a line cook named Jenna, nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "He did the same to me, pushed me against a wall when I asked for a raise, told me I'd be on the streets if I opened my mouth." The room exploded into chaos, voices overlapping as more staff came forward, their stories pouring out like a dam breaking. Patrons stood, some shouting questions, others pulling out their phones to record the unfolding scene. Victor stumbled back, his face a mask of panic, his authority crumbling under the weight of the truth. "This is ridiculous," he yelled, his voice cracking. "You're all fired. You hear me? Fired." But his words were drowned out by the crowd, their anger a rising tide that he couldn't stem. Lila's hands trembled as she held the notebook, her voice cutting through the chaos like a beacon. "My mother isn't the only one," she said, her eyes locked on Victor. "You've hurt so many people here, made them feel small, made them afraid. But we're not afraid anymore." She turned to the crowd, her voice softening, a plea wrapped in resolve. "If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been hurt by someone like him, please, speak. Don't let silence bury the truth." Maria stepped forward, her sobs quieting as she wiped her eyes, her voice shaking but firm. "I stayed silent for my daughter," she said, her gaze steady on Victor. But I won't anymore. You hurt me. You hurt us all. And we deserve better. The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of support that washed over the room, drowning out Victor's protests. A woman in the back, a regular patron, stood and began to clap, her tears streaming down her face. Others joined, the sound building into a crescendo, a chorus of voices that refused to be silenced any longer. Lila looked at her mother, a small smile breaking through her tears, and Maria nodded, her pride a quiet flame in the storm. The truth had been spoken, but the storm was far from over. Victor's reign was crumbling, and the secret Lila had only begun to unravel would soon bring justice to the Silver Oak and beyond. The dining hall of the Silver Oak reverberated with the sound of applause, a swelling tide of voices that refused to be silenced. On this May evening in 2025, the San Francisco elite, once cloaked in indifference, now stood in solidarity, their clapping hands a thunderous rebuke to the injustice that had festered beneath the restaurant's polished veneer. Crystal chandeliers flickered overhead, their golden light catching the tears on the faces of patrons and staff alike, as the truth Lila Monroe had spoken settled into their hearts like a long overdue rain. Lila, at 15, stood on the small stage, her faded blue dress a beacon of resilience, her worn notebook trembling in her hands. Her brown eyes, glistening with tears, met her mother's across the room, and in that moment, the dishwasher's daughter felt the weight of her words ripple outward, a wave that would soon crash over the Silver Oak and beyond. Maria Monroe stood near the kitchen doors, her hands no longer clutching the dish towel but raised to her chest, as if to hold her racing heart. The applause washed over her, a balm to wounds she'd carried in silence for years, and she let out a shaky breath, her sobs giving way to a quiet, trembling smile. She'd stayed silent for so long, swallowing the pain of Victor Langston's cruelty to protect her daughter, but Lila's courage had shattered that silence. Maria's eyes locked on her daughter, pride swelling in her chest, a fierce love that had carried her through every grueling shift, every bruise, every whispered threat. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the applause, soft but resolute. "I'm not invisible anymore," she said, her words a declaration, a reclaiming of her worth. Victor Langston's face was a storm of rage and panic, his tailored tuxedo now a mockery of the control he'd once wielded. The general manager of the Silver Oak stood at the edge of the stage, his hands clenched into fists, his green eyes darting between Lila, Maria, and the crowd that had turned against him. The applause, the tears, the staff stepping forward with their own stories of abuse. It was a tidal wave he couldn't stop, and he felt his empire slipping away with every clap. "This is a disgrace," he shouted, his voice cracking as he tried to reclaim the narrative. "These are lies, fabrications. You can't believe a dishwasher and her kid over me." But his words fell flat, drowned out by the crowd's murmurs, their faces no longer amused but alight with anger and empathy. A man in a three-piece suit, a venture capitalist who dined at the Silver Oak for years, stood and pointed at Victor, his voice booming over the din. "We've heard enough," he said, his tone sharp with disgust. "You've abused your power for too long. We're not blind anymore." A woman in a glittering gown, a local philanthropist, nodded, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've seen Maria here for years, always working, always quiet. I never knew. I should have known." She turned to Lila, her eyes soft with regret. "Thank you for speaking, sweetheart. You've opened our eyes." Lila's hands shook as she held the microphone, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. She hadn't expected this. The applause, the support, the way her mother's pain had become a rallying cry for everyone in the room. She'd only wanted to tell the truth, to give voice to the invisible, but now the room was alive with it, a chorus of voices that refused to be silenced. She glanced at Victor, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "You thought I'd be nothing," she said, her words a quiet fire. "But my mother taught me that even the smallest voices can be heard if they're true." Victor lunged forward, his hand reaching for the microphone, his face twisted with desperation. "Enough of this," he snarled, his voice a hiss. "You're done here. Both of you. Get out." But before he could grab the microphone, Carlos, the waiter who'd spoken earlier, stepped onto the stage, his broad frame blocking Victor's path. "Don't touch her," Carlos said, his voice low but firm, his eyes burning with years of pent-up anger. Jenna, the line cook, joined him, her arms crossed, her tears replaced by defiance. "We're done with you, Victor," she said, her voice steady. "You don't own us anymore." The crowd roared, their applause turning into chants of support. "Let her speak! Let her speak!" As more staff joined Carlos and Jenna on the stage, forming a protective circle around Lila, a young busboy named Miguel pulled out his phone, live streaming the moment to his social media, his voice trembling with excitement as he narrated. "This is happening right now at the Silver Oak," he said, his camera capturing Victor's pale, sweating face. "The truth is coming out, and they can't stop it." Victor staggered back, his hands raised as if to ward off the crowd, but there was nowhere to run. The live stream was already spreading, the hashtag #SilverOakTruth trending on X within minutes, clips of Lila's speech and the staff's rebellion racking up thousands of views. Patrons who'd once toasted Victor's name now turned their backs, some whispering to their assistants to pull investments, others vowing to never return. A woman in a red dress, a food critic with a massive following, typed furiously on her phone, her post reading, "The Silver Oaks Gala just became a reckoning. A girl's truth exposed a tyrant. #SilverOakTruth." Maria climbed the steps to the stage, her hands trembling as she reached for Lila, pulling her daughter into a fierce hug. "I'm so proud of you, Mija," she whispered, her voice breaking as she pressed a kiss to Lila's forehead. Lila clung to her mother, her tears soaking into Maria's apron, the weight of the moment crashing over her. She'd spoken for her mother, for herself, for every invisible worker in that kitchen, and the room had heard her. But the story wasn't over. The truth Lila had begun to unravel, the full scope of Victor's cruelty, the secrets buried in the Silver Oak's pristine walls, was only the beginning, and the storm of justice was just gathering strength. The dining hall of the Silver Oak was a crucible of emotion, the air thick with the weight of truth and the roar of a crowd awakened on this May evening in 2025. The San Francisco elite, once content to sip champagne under the glow of crystal chandeliers, now stood as witnesses to a reckoning, their voices a unified chant. "Let her speak! Let her speak!" echoing off the polished mahogany walls. On the small stage at the front of the hall, Lila Monroe stood encircled by the restaurant staff, her small frame a beacon of defiance in her faded blue dress. At 15, the dishwasher's daughter had turned a cruel dare into a revolution, her story of her mother Maria's suffering igniting a fire that now burned through the room. Her worn notebook lay closed on the podium, its pages a silent witness to the truth that had brought the crowd to its feet. Victor Langston's polished facade had shattered, his tailored tuxedo now a stark contrast to the sweat beading on his brow, his green eyes wild with panic. The general manager of the Silver Oak had underestimated Lila, thinking her a mere child to be mocked, but her words had stripped him bare, exposing years of cruelty to the staff. The crowd's chants, the staff's rebellion, the live stream capturing every moment. It was a storm he couldn't weather. "You're all making a mistake," he shouted, his voice hoarse, his hands flailing as he tried to reclaim the stage. "This is my restaurant. You can't do this." But his words were drowned out by the crowd, their anger a rising tide that swept him aside. Maria Monroe stood beside her daughter, her arms wrapped around Lila in a protective embrace, her tear-streaked face a mix of pride and fear. The applause, the support. It was more than she'd ever dreamed of, but the memory of Victor's threats, his grip on her wrist, his hissed warnings, lingered like a shadow. She glanced at the crowd, her heart pounding as she saw the phones raised, the live streams broadcasting their story to the world. #SilverOakTruth was trending on X, the clips of Lila's speech and the staff's defiance spreading like wildfire, shared by thousands who'd never set foot in the restaurant but felt the weight of her words. Maria squeezed Lila's hand, her voice a whisper. "You did it, Mija. You spoke for us all." Lila's eyes were still wet with tears, but her voice was steady as she stepped back to the microphone, the staff parting to let her speak. "There's more," she said, her words cutting through the chants, silencing the room once again. The crowd leaned forward, their breath held, as Lila opened her notebook, her fingers finding a page marked with a small, pressed flower, a memento from a day she'd never forget. "Last year," she began, her voice a quiet storm, "my mother came home with a letter. It was a warning from Mr. Langston, telling her she'd be fired if she didn't work unpaid overtime for a month. She was already working doubles, already exhausted, but she couldn't say no. She couldn't afford to lose this job." A murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd, their faces darkening as Lila continued. "She worked those hours," Lila said, her voice trembling with the weight of the memory. "She worked until she collapsed in the kitchen one night, her hands shaking, her body giving out. And do you know what Mr. Langston did? He didn't call a doctor. He didn't help her. He told her to get up, to stop making a scene, or she'd be out on the street." The crowd gasped, their outrage turning to a low, angry hum, as Lila's voice rose, a crescendo of pain and defiance. She was on the floor, crying, and he walked away. He walked away like she was nothing. Victor's face turned crimson, his hands shaking as he lunged toward Lila, his voice a roar. "That's a lie. I never." But before he could reach her, Carlos, the waiter who'd stood by Lila, grabbed his arm, his grip iron tight. "Don't you dare," Carlos growled, his voice thick with years of suppressed anger. Jenna, the line cook, stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "I was there," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I saw it happen. I helped Maria up that night. She could barely stand, but you didn't care. You never cared." The crowd erupted, their chants turning to shouts of "Shame on you!" as they surged toward the stage, their anger a palpable force. Victor wrenched his arm free, his face a mask of fury, but the live streams were capturing every moment, every word, every flash of guilt in his eyes. The hashtag Silver Oak Truth climbed higher, trending globally now, as clips of Lila's speech and Victor's unraveling spread across X, TikTok, and Instagram. A local journalist in the crowd, a woman named Elena Carter, typed furiously on her phone, her post reading, "The Silver Oak is burning tonight. Not with fire, but with truth. A girl's voice just toppled a tyrant." Hashtag Silver Oak Truth. Her post went viral within minutes, shared by activists, celebrities, and everyday people who saw in Lila a symbol of the invisible, a voice for the voiceless. Maria's hands shook as she clung to Lila, her voice a whisper over the roar of the crowd. "I didn't want you to know," she said, her words breaking with guilt. "I didn't want you to carry this." Lila turned to her mother, her eyes fierce with love. "You carried it for me," she said, her voice a quiet vow. "Now I'm carrying it for you." The crowd's shouts grew louder, their anger directed at Victor, who now stood alone at the edge of the stage, his empire crumbling around him. A man in a gray suit, a board member of the Silver Oaks parent company, pushed through the crowd, his face grim as he climbed the stage. "Mr. Langston," he said, his voice cold, "you're done. Step down now." Victor's eyes widened, his voice a desperate plea. "You can't do this. I built this place." But the board member shook his head, his tone unyielding. "You broke it, and now we'll fix it." The crowd cheered, their voices a thunderous wave, as Victor was escorted off the stage, his head bowed. His reign over the Silver Oak ended in a single, shattering night. Lila watched him go, her heart pounding, but the storm wasn't over. The truth she'd begun to share, the full scope of her mother's suffering, the secrets buried in the Silver Oaks history, was only the beginning. And as the crowd turned to her, their eyes filled with tears and hope, Lila knew she'd sparked a movement that would echo far beyond this room. Chapter 6. Echoes Beyond the Walls. The grand dining hall of the Silver Oak was a storm of emotion, the echoes of the crowd's cheers lingering in the air like the aftershocks of an earthquake on this May evening in 2025. The San Francisco elite, their velvet chairs now abandoned, stood shoulder to shoulder with the restaurant's staff. Their voices united in a chant of "Justice! Justice!" that reverberated off the mahogany walls. The crystal chandeliers above cast fractured light across the room, a fitting metaphor for the shattered illusion of perfection that had once defined the Silver Oak. Lila Monroe, at 15, stood at the center of the stage, her faded blue dress a stark contrast to the opulence around her. Her small hands clutching her mother Maria's as the weight of their shared truth settled over the crowd. The dishwasher's daughter had spoken, and her words had brought down a tyrant. Victor Langston was gone, escorted off the stage by the board member, his tailored tuxedo a crumpled reminder of the power he'd lost. The once arrogant general manager of the Silver Oak had been stripped of his title in a matter of minutes. His reign of cruelty ended by the courage of a girl he dared to mock. But the storm Lila had unleashed was far from over. The live streams that had captured every moment, Lila's speech, the staff's rebellion, Victor's unraveling, were spreading across the internet at a dizzying pace. The hashtag Silver Oak Truth had gone global, trending on X, TikTok, and Instagram, with millions sharing clips of Lila's quiet defiance, her voice a beacon for the invisible. A viral post from a San Francisco influencer read, "A girl just turned a gala into a revolution. The Silver Oak will never be the same." Hashtag Silver Oak Truth. Lila stood beside her mother, her brown eyes wide with a mix of awe and exhaustion. As the crowd surged toward the stage, their hands outstretched, their voices a chorus of gratitude. "You're incredible, Lila," shouted a woman in a red dress, her mascara streaked with tears. "Thank you for speaking up," called a man in a suit, his voice thick with emotion. Carlos, the waiter who'd stood by Lila, wiped his eyes and clapped her on the shoulder, his smile bright with pride. "You gave us our voice back," he said, his voice trembling. Jenna, the line cook, nodded, her arms crossed but her eyes soft. "We're free now," she whispered, as if saying it aloud made it real. Maria Monroe held her daughter close, her hands still trembling, but her tears had turned to a quiet, radiant joy. She looked out at the crowd, at the staff who'd worked beside her for years, their faces alight with a hope she'd never thought possible. "I never dreamed this day would come," she said, her voice a whisper against Lila's hair. "You did this, Mija. You made them see us." Lila hugged her mother tighter, her own tears falling freely now, the weight of the moment crashing over her. She'd spoken for her mother, for the staff, for every invisible worker who'd been silenced by Victor's cruelty, but she hadn't expected the world to listen. Not like this. Outside the dining hall, the night air was electric with the buzz of reporters and onlookers who'd gathered at the restaurant's entrance, drawn by the viral live streams. News vans lined the street, their cameras trained on the glass doors, waiting for a glimpse of the girl who'd turned a gala into a reckoning. Elena Carter, the journalist who'd been in the crowd, stood among them, her phone still in hand as she posted updates to her followers. "Victor Langston is out," she typed, her fingers flying across the screen. "The Silver Oak staff are speaking up, and it's all because of a 15-year-old girl named Lila Monroe." Hashtag Silver Oak Truth. Her post was shared thousands of times within minutes, picked up by national news outlets, trending alongside hashtags like hashtag Justice for Maria and hashtag Speak Your Truth. Inside, the board member who dismissed Victor, a man named Richard Ellison, approached Lila and Maria. His gray suit rumpled from the chaos, but his expression one of quiet respect. "Ms. Monroe," he said, addressing Maria first, his voice steady. "On behalf of the board, I want to apologize for what you've endured. We had no idea. But that's no excuse. We failed you and we'll make it right." He turned to Lila, his eyes softening. "And you, young lady, you've done something extraordinary tonight. We'd like to hear more, if you're willing. Not just your story, but your ideas for how we can change this place." Lila blinked, caught off guard by the offer, her heart racing as she glanced at her mother. Maria nodded, her smile a quiet encouragement, and Lila took a deep breath, her voice small but firm. I'd like that," she said, her eyes meeting Richard's. "But only if my mother and the staff are part of it." They're the ones who've kept this place alive. Richard nodded, a flicker of admiration in his gaze. Of course, he said. We'll start tomorrow. A new chapter for the Silver Oak. One built on respect. The crowd cheered again, their voices a wave of support, as Richard stepped back, giving Lila and Maria the stage. But the moment was interrupted by a commotion at the entrance. A murmur of voices that grew louder as a group of people pushed through the glass doors. Leading them was a woman in her late 50s, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face a mirror of Maria's but etched with years of grief. She carried a small box in her hands. Her steps hurried as she scanned the room, her eyes landing on Maria and Lila. "Maria!" she called, her voice breaking with emotion, and Maria froze, her breath catching as she recognized her sister, Anna, who she hadn't seen in years. Anna rushed to the stage, her arms wrapping around Maria in a fierce hug, her tears falling freely. "I saw the live stream," she said, her voice choked with sobs. "I came as fast as I could. I brought something." She opened the box, revealing a stack of letters, their edges yellowed with age, tied with a faded ribbon. "These are from Mama," Anna said, her hands trembling as she handed them to Maria. "She wrote them before she passed. About you. About your dreams. About how proud she was. I kept them, hoping one day I'd find you again." Maria's hands shook as she took the letters, her tears spilling over as she clutched them to her chest, the weight of her mother's love a lifeline in the storm. Lila watched, her own tears falling, as Anna turned to her, her eyes soft with recognition. "You must be Lila," she said, her voice a whisper. "You look just like her. Just like Maria when she was your age." Lila nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and Anna pulled her into a hug, the three of them clinging to each other as the crowd watched, their cheers giving way to a reverent silence. The letters were only the beginning, a glimpse of the past that would soon unravel more truths about the Silver Oak, truths that would demand justice far beyond Victor's fall. But for now, Lila stood with her mother and her aunt, their hands intertwined, their tears a testament to the power of family and the strength of speaking out. The storm of truth had broken, and its echoes would soon reach far beyond the walls of the Silver Oak. The dining hall of the Silver Oak had transformed from a stage of opulence to a sanctuary of shared humanity, the echoes of the crowd's reverent silence lingering on this May evening in 2025. The San Francisco skyline glittered beyond the tall windows, a backdrop of stars and city lights that seemed to mirror the newfound hope in the room. Lila Monroe stood on the small stage, her faded blue dress catching the soft glow of the chandeliers, her small hands intertwined with those of her mother, Maria, and her aunt, Anna. At 15, the dishwasher's daughter had turned a cruel dare into a movement, her story of her mother's suffering at the Silver Oak igniting a fire of justice that had already claimed Victor Langston's reign. Now, as the crowd watched with tear-streaked faces, the reunion of a fractured family became the heart of a night that would never be forgotten. Maria Monroe clutched the stack of yellowed letters Anna had brought, her mother's words a lifeline to a past she'd thought lost forever. The faded ribbon that tied them together trembled in her hands, each letter a testament to the love and dreams her mother had held for her before she passed. A love Maria had carried through years of hardship at the Silver Oak. Her tears fell freely now, soaking into the paper, as she looked at Anna, her sister, who she hadn't seen since their mother's funeral a decade ago. "I thought I'd lost you too," Maria whispered, her voice breaking, her hands reaching to cup Anna's face. Anna's own tears mirrored her sister's, her arms wrapping around Maria in a hug that bridged years of separation. "I never stopped looking for you," Anna said, her voice thick with emotion. "When I saw the live stream, I knew I had to come." Lila watched, her heart swelling with a mix of joy and sorrow, as her mother and aunt clung to each other, their shared grief and love a quiet melody in the storm of the evening. She'd always known her mother's strength, but seeing Anna, her silver-streaked hair, her face so like Maria's, brought a new layer of understanding to the family she'd only known in fragments. The crowd, still gathered around the stage, watched in awe, their earlier chance of justice giving way to a soft murmur of respect. A woman in a red dress, a local philanthropist, wiped her eyes and whispered to her companion. "This is more than a story. This is a legacy." Anna pulled back, her hand still holding Maria's, and turned to Lila, her eyes softening with a tenderness that made Lila's chest ache. "You're so brave," Anna said, her voice a whisper as she brushed a tear from Lila's cheek. "You've done what we couldn't. You gave your mother her voice back." She reached into the box she'd brought, pulling out a small, faded photograph, its edges worn from years of handling. "This was taken when your mom and I were kids," Anna said, handing it to Lila. The photo showed two young girls, their arms around each other, standing in front of a small house with a garden of sunflowers. Maria, barely 10, grinned at the camera, her eyes bright with dreams, while Anna, a few years older, hugged her tight, a protective older sister even then. Lila traced her fingers over the photo, her tears falling as she looked at her mother's younger self, a girl who dreamed of teaching, of helping others, before life and the silver oak had ground those dreams to dust. "She was so happy," Lila whispered, her voice breaking, and Maria nodded, her own tears falling as she pulled Lila close. "She wanted so much for us," Maria said, her voice a quiet song of memory. "And now you've given that back to her, Lila. You've made her proud." The crowd parted as Richard Ellison, the board member who dismissed Victor, approached the stage again, his gray suit now unbuttoned, his face a mix of determination and humility. "Ms. Monroe," he said, addressing Maria, his voice steady but respectful, "we've already contacted the authorities. Victor will face consequences for what he's done. Not just to you, but to everyone here." He turned to the staff, who stood around the stage, their faces a mix of relief and resolve. "And we're launching an investigation into the restaurant's practices. No one will suffer in silence again." The staff erupted in cheers, their voices a wave of gratitude, as Carlos, Jenna, and Miguel, the waiter, line cook, and busboy who'd stood by Lila, hugged each other, their tears a mix of joy and vindication. The crowd joined in, their applause a thunderous affirmation, as Richard continued, his voice rising over the noise. "We're also establishing a fund, effective immediately, to support the staff of the Silver Oak, back pay, better wages, and resources for anyone who's been hurt under Victor's management." He looked at Lila, his eyes softening. "And Lila, we'd like you to be a voice in that process if you're willing. Your courage tonight has changed everything." Lila's breath caught, her eyes widening as she glanced at her mother, then at Anna, who nodded with a proud smile. I'd like that," Lila said, her voice small but firm, a spark of purpose igniting in her chest. The crowd cheered again, their voices a chorus of support, as the live streams continued to spread, the hashtag #SilverOakTruth climbing higher, now trending across the globe. A tweet from a national news anchor read, "A 15-year-old girl just brought down a tyrant at the Silver Oak with nothing but her story. This is the power of truth. #SilverOakTruth." Back on the stage, Anna handed Maria the box of letters, her voice a whisper over the crowd's cheers. "There's more in here," she said, her eyes glistening. "Letters, photos, and something else Mama left for you." Maria opened the box, her hands trembling, and pulled out a small velvet pouch, its fabric worn but intact. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, a tiny sunflower pendant glinting in the light, a symbol of the garden where she and Anna had played as children, a symbol of their mother's love. Maria's sob broke free, her fingers closing around the pendant, as she looked at Lila, her voice a whisper. "She's here with us, Mija. She always has been." Lila's tears fell as she touched the pendant, her heart aching with the weight of her grandmother's love, a love that had carried her family through years of pain. The crowd watched, their silence a sacred space, as the three women stood together, their hands linked, their tears a testament to the power of family and the strength of speaking out. The truth Lila had shared had already changed the Silver Oak, but the echoes of that truth were only beginning to ripple outward, a wave of justice and healing that would soon touch the world. The Silver Oak stood as a beacon of change in the heart of San Francisco, its grand dining hall now a symbol of justice rather than opulence, as the morning sun rose on May 26, 2025. The events of the previous night had spread like wildfire, the hashtag SilverOakTruth trending globally, with millions across the world sharing clips of Lila Monroe's speech, the staff's rebellion, and Victor Langston's downfall. The restaurant's glass doors, once a gateway to exclusivity, were now surrounded by reporters, activists, and supporters who'd gathered outside, holding signs that read, "Justice for Maria" and "Truth Prevails." Inside, the air was electric with a newfound hope, as Lila Monroe, her mother Maria, and her aunt Anna stood together in the staff break room, a quiet sanctuary amidst the storm they'd unleashed. Lila, at 15, sat on a worn couch, her faded blue dress replaced by a borrowed sweater and jeans, her small hands clutching the silver sunflower necklace her grandmother had left for Maria. Her brown eyes were red from tears, but they shone with a quiet determination that had captivated the world overnight. Beside her, Maria held the box of letters Anna had brought, her fingers tracing the faded ribbon as if it could summon her mother's voice. Anna sat across from them, her silver-streaked hair catching the morning light, her face a mix of grief and pride as she watched her niece and sister. The break room, with its flickering fluorescent lights and chipped formica table, was a far cry from the dining hall's grandeur, but it felt like home, a space where the invisible had finally been seen. The news of Victor's removal had dominated headlines, with national outlets running stories titled, "A Girl's Truth Topples a Restaurant Empire," and "The Silver Oak Scandal, a Reckoning for Justice." The live streams from the gala had racked up tens of millions of views, shared by celebrities, activists, and everyday people who saw in Lila a symbol of courage. A viral Instagram post from a prominent chef read, "Lila Monroe spoke for every restaurant worker who's been silenced. The Silver Oak isn't just a restaurant anymore. It's a movement." #SilverOakTruth. The hashtag had become a rallying cry, sparking conversations about workplace abuse and the power of speaking out across the country. Inside the break room, Richard Ellison, the board member who dismissed Victor, knocked softly on the door, his gray suit now replaced by a simple blazer, his face lined with exhaustion but resolute. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice respectful, and Maria nodded, her hands tightening around the box of letters. Richard stepped inside, his gaze settling on Lila with a mix of awe and gratitude. "The board met this morning," he said, his tone steady. "Victor is officially terminated, and he's facing charges, multiple counts of workplace harassment and assault, thanks to the statements from the staff and the evidence you've brought forward." He looked at Maria, his eyes softening. "We've also secured a settlement for you, Ms. Monroe. Back pay, compensation for what you endured, and a formal apology from the company." Maria's breath caught, her tears falling as she nodded, her voice a whisper. "Thank you," she said, her hands trembling as she clutched the box tighter. "But it's not just about me. It's about everyone here." Richard nodded, his expression earnest. "It is," he said. "We're implementing new policies, better wages, mental health support, a zero-tolerance policy for abuse. And we'd like you to be part of that process if you're willing. Your voice, and Lila's, will help us rebuild this place the right way." Lila's heart raced, her eyes meeting her mother's, then Anna's, who gave her a proud nod. "I'll do it," Lila said, her voice small but firm, a spark of purpose igniting within her. "But only if the staff are heard too. They're the ones who've suffered the most." Richard smiled, a genuine warmth in his gaze. "Agreed," he said. "We'll start with a meeting tomorrow, all staff, all voices welcome. The Silver Oak will be a place of respect from now on." Outside, the crowd of supporters grew, their chants of "Justice for Maria" echoing through the morning air. A local news crew interviewed Carlos, the waiter who'd stood by Lila, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke to the camera. "Lila gave us our courage back," he said, his eyes shining with tears. "She spoke for all of us, and now the world is listening." #SilverOakTruth. His words were shared across social media, the hashtag climbing higher, as restaurants across the city began to speak out, their own stories of workplace abuse pouring forth in a wave of solidarity. Back in the break room, Anna opened the box of letters, pulling out a small, faded journal, its pages filled with her mother's handwriting. "There's something else here," she said, her voice trembling as she handed it to Maria. "Mama kept a diary, entries about her dreams for you, and warnings about people she didn't trust." Maria's hands shook as she opened the journal, her eyes scanning the pages, her breath catching as she read a passage aloud. "I've heard whispers at the Silver Oak," her mother had written, her script tight with worry. "There's a man named Victor who watches me too closely. I think he knows I've seen the books. They're hiding something. I'm afraid, but I'll keep working for Maria, for her future." Lila's heart stopped, her eyes widening as she looked at her mother, then at Anna. "What does that mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and realization. Anna's face darkened, her voice low. "It means there's more to Victor's cruelty than we thought," she said. "Mama suspected something bigger." Maria's tears fell anew, her hands clutching the journal, as the weight of her mother's words settled over them. The truth Lila had begun to share had already brought down Victor, but this journal hinted at a deeper injustice, one that could unravel the Silver Oak's very foundation. The crowd outside erupted in cheers as a news van broadcasted a breaking update. Victor Langston has been arrested on charges of workplace abuse, with more allegations emerging. Lila, Maria, and Anna stood together, their hands linked, as the echoes of justice rippled outward, a movement that would soon shake the city and the world beyond the walls of the Silver Oak. The Silver Oak stood as a transformed landmark in San Francisco, its once pristine reputation now a canvas of raw truth on the morning of May 27, 2025. The city buzzed with the aftermath of the Gala 2 nights prior, the hashtag Silver Oak Truth a global phenomenon, with millions sharing Lila Monroe's story of courage and the downfall of Victor Langston. Newsstands across the city bore headlines like, "The Silver Oak Revolution. A girl's voice shakes an empire," while social media platforms overflowed with posts, videos, and tributes to the 15-year-old dishwasher's daughter who'd sparked a movement. Outside the restaurant, a makeshift memorial had sprung up, flowers, candles, and handwritten notes left by supporters, their messages a chorus of gratitude. "Thank you, Lila, for speaking for us all, and justice for Maria." Inside, the air was heavy with the promise of change, as Lila, her mother Maria, and her Aunt Anna sat in the staff break room, the faded journal of Maria's mother lying open on the table between them. Lila traced her fingers over the journal's yellowed pages, her brown eyes clouded with a mix of awe and unease. The entries, penned by her grandmother decades ago, were a window into a past Maria had never fully shared, a past that hinted at a deeper injustice within the Silver Oak's history. The passage Maria had read the day before, "There's a man named Victor who watches me too closely. I think he knows I've seen the books," had cast a shadow over their newfound hope, a shadow that grew darker with each new entry Lila read. "He's hiding something," her grandmother had written, her script tight with fear. "Money disappearing, staff vanishing. I fear for my girls if I speak." Lila's heart pounded, her gaze lifting to her mother, whose face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the silver sunflower pendant around her neck. Anna, her silver-streaked hair pulled back, leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "Mama always suspected something was wrong," she said, her eyes meeting Maria's. "She wrote about it for years, missing funds, threats, people who disappeared after asking questions. She thought Victor was involved, even back then." Maria's breath hitched, her tears falling as she shook her head. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She never told me. She was protecting us." Lila reached for her mother's hand, her own voice trembling but resolute. "She's still protecting us," she said, her fingers tightening around Maria's. "Through these words, we have to finish what she started." The break room door opened, and Richard Ellison, the board member who dismissed Victor, stepped inside, his face lined with exhaustion but his eyes alight with determination. "Good morning," he said, his voice respectful as he nodded to the three women. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Maria wiped her tears, her voice steady despite the storm within. No, please, she said, gesturing to a chair. Richard sat, his hands clasped on the table, his gaze settling on the journal. I've spoken with the authorities, he said, his tone grave. Victor's arrest is just the beginning. They're launching a full investigation into the Silver Oak's finances and past practices, based on the staff statements and the evidence you've provided. He paused, his eyes meeting Lila's, a flicker of admiration in his gaze. But there's more, he continued, pulling a small USB drive from his pocket. One of the staff, Jenna, the line cook, came forward with this. It's a recording from last year, of Victor threatening her after she reported a coworker's injury. He admitted to falsifying records to avoid liability. Maria's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock, as Anna's face darkened, her voice a low growl. He's been doing this for years, she said, her hands clenching into fists. And no one stopped him. Richard nodded, his expression grim. That's why we need your help, he said, looking at Lila. This recording, combined with your grandmother's journal, could be the key to uncovering everything. Decades of corruption, abuse, maybe even what happened to your mother's mother. Lila's breath caught, her heart racing as she glanced at the journal. Then at the USB drive, the weight of her grandmother's legacy pressing down on her. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. Richard's voice softened, his tone careful. There's a chance her disappearance wasn't an accident. The journal, these entries, they suggest she knew too much. We're working with investigators to reopen her case. Maria's sob broke the silence, her hands covering her face as the memory of her mother's loss flooded back. The unanswered questions, the grief that had never healed. Lila wrapped her arms around her mother, her own tears falling, as Anna reached for Maria's other hand, the three women holding each other through the storm of their shared pain. We'll find the truth, Lila whispered, her voice fierce with resolve. For her, for all of us. Richard nodded, his voice a quiet promise. We will. And Lila, the board wants you to know, we're naming a scholarship fund after your grandmother, to support young women from underserved communities who want to pursue their dreams. It's the least we can do. The crowd outside grew louder, their chants of justice for Maria, joined by new voices, as more former employees of the Silver Oak arrived, their own stories spilling forth in the wake of Lila's courage. A local activist group had organized a rally, their banners reading "End Workplace Abuse" and "Speak Your Truth," their voices amplified by megaphones as they called for reform across the city's restaurant industry. The hashtag Silver Oak Truth continued to trend, now joined by hashtag Justice for Maria, as national news outlets picked up the story, with headlines like "A Teen's Speech Sparks a Movement." The Silver Oak's dark secrets revealed. Back in the break room, Lila looked at the journal, her grandmother's words a call to action that echoed through the generations. The truth she'd shared had already changed the Silver Oak, but the deeper secrets her grandmother had left behind were only beginning to surface, a legacy of courage that would soon shake the city to its core. The Silver Oak stood as a transformed monument in San Francisco, its legacy rewritten by the courage of a young girl as the golden hues of late autumn painted the city on November 15, 2025. 6 months had passed since that fateful May night when Lila Monroe, the 15-year-old daughter of a dishwasher, had taken the stage at the restaurant's Gala, her story of her mother Maria's suffering igniting a movement that echoed far beyond the city's borders. The hashtag Silver Oak Truth had become a global rallying cry, inspiring millions to speak out against workplace abuse, with Lila's words shared in countless posts, videos, and articles. The restaurant's glass doors, once a symbol of exclusivity, now open to a new era, one of transparency, respect, and healing. Its walls adorned with framed letters from supporters, a testament to the power of truth. Lila sat on the terrace of the Monroe family's new apartment, a modest but cozy space in a safer part of San Francisco, funded by the settlement Maria had received from the Silver Oak. The morning sun glinted off the silver sunflower pendant around her neck, a keepsake from her grandmother that had become a symbol of her family's resilience. At her side, Maria sipped a cup of tea, her hands no longer raw from scrubbing pots, her face radiant with a peace she hadn't known in years. Anna, Lila's aunt, sat across from them, her silver-streaked hair catching the light, a stack of letters and journals on the table between them, the legacy of their mother, whose truths had sparked a reckoning that reshaped the city. The investigation into the Silver Oak, spurred by Lila's speech and the evidence from her grandmother's journal, had uncovered decades of corruption. Victor Langston, the former general manager, had been convicted on multiple counts of workplace harassment and assault, with additional charges of financial fraud added after investigators discovered he'd been siphoning funds from the restaurant for years. The journal entries, detailing Victor's threats and the missing staff, had led to the reopening of Lila's grandmother's case, revealing her disappearance had been no accident. She'd been silenced after uncovering the restaurant's illicit dealings, a truth that brought closure to Maria and Anna after years of grief. Victor's sentencing had made national headlines, with the judge citing Lila's courage as a catalyst for justice. A young girl's voice brought down a house of lies, the judge had said, her words shared across social media under #JusticeForMaria. The Silver Oak had been reborn under new leadership, with Richard Ellison and a reformed board implementing sweeping changes. Better wages, mental health support, and a zero-tolerance policy for abuse. Maria had been promoted to a staff advocate role, her voice now a cornerstone of the restaurant's operations, ensuring no one would suffer in silence again. Carlos, Jenna, and Miguel, the waiter, line cook, and busboy who'd stood by Lila, had become leaders in the movement, speaking at rallies across the city to advocate for restaurant workers' rights. The restaurant had even launched a community kitchen, serving free meals to those in need, a tribute to Maria's dream of helping others. Lila, now 16, had become a symbol of hope, her story inspiring a wave of change across the restaurant industry. The Silver Oak Truth Fund, established in her grandmother's name, had raised millions to support young women from underserved communities, offering scholarships and mentorship programs. Lila had been invited to speak at schools, community centers, and even national conferences, her quiet voice a melody that moved hearts wherever she went. A viral video of her speech at a women's empowerment summit had racked up millions of views, with a caption reading, "Lila Monroe proves that truth can heal. Her story is our story. #SpeakYourTruth." Back on the terrace, Lila opened her notebook, its pages now filled with new stories, poems, reflections, dreams of a future where no one felt invisible. Maria watched her daughter, her eyes soft with pride, as Anna pulled a small violin from a case beside her. "This was Mama's," Anna said, her voice trembling as she handed it to Lila. "She played it for us when we were little. I kept it all these years. For you." Lila's breath caught, her fingers brushing the polished wood, the instrument a bridge to the grandmother she'd never met but whose legacy she carried. Lila lifted the violin to her chin, her hand steady as she drew the bow across the strings, the first note a soft, haunting melody that seemed to carry the weight of her family's journey. The music swelled, rich and soaring, filling the terrace with a song of pain, hope, and triumph. A melody that echoed the one she'd played in her mind the night she spoke at the gala. Maria and Anna listened, their tears falling as the notes wove a tapestry of their shared past, each one a tribute to the woman who'd dreamed for them, who'd fought for them, who'd left them a legacy of courage. Across the city, the echoes of Lila's truth continued to ripple. Restaurants implemented new policies, inspired by the Silver Oak's transformation, while workers shared their own stories under #SpeakYourTruth, a movement that had grown into a national call for justice. A billboard overlooking the city skyline lit up at dusk, showing a photograph of Lila, Maria, and Anna standing together, their hands linked, with the words, "The Silver Oak Truth, a legacy of justice." Lila's melody carried on the wind, a song of healing that reached far beyond the terrace, a reminder that the smallest voices could sing the loudest truths, and that justice, once spoken, could never be silenced. Thank you for joining Endless Stories on this journey of courage, truth, and healing with Lila, Maria, and Anna. If their story moved you, if you believe in the power of speaking out, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to catch every tale we share. Drop "Truth Prevails" in the comments below. Share this video with those you love, and join us in spreading the melody of justice. Until our next story, keep speaking your truth.